I really appreciate it, Chris. Great to be with everybody. As Chris mentioned, I'm an extension forester with Purdue University, but I had an opportunity to cooperate with the Illinois program several times. And of course, it's always a pleasure to work with Hank and everybody else as well, Adam, and really appreciate this opportunity to spend some time with you. So hopefully I'm going to set a little bit of a stage here of how you can look at harvesting timber as part of your forest management program and planning, and kind of plug it into wherever it fits best for you. And this may be something that some folks are a little concerned about, and that's actually okay. I'm going to try to make the case for how this might fit into your property management objectives. So why do we sell timber? What are some folks interested in doing this, and what kind of benefit can we derive from it? We can capture tree mortality. So as trees get larger, they occupy more space, and ultimately something's got to give, and that competition will ultimately lead to tree mortality. Harvesting can actually capture some of that as we go. By capturing that and actually creating additional space, much like the crop tree management system that Hank showed, we can maintain good forest growth. It's a thinning process that we can use to provide additional space for those trees that remain after the harvest to have more room to grow. By controlling the amount of sunlight that we have reaching the forest floor, we can actually regenerate a variety of different species of trees and shrubs. And we'll talk about some of the light requirements of a variety of different tree species that you may be interested in for whatever your management goals are. Adam did a really nice job of providing the habitat development and diversity aspect of using timber harvesting tools. So you've already got a good idea of how that can go. And as we look at this presentation, I want you to continue to think about those options with some of the characteristics and photos that I show you of these different harvesting techniques. There's significant economic value in trees. Here in the Midwest, in the central hardwood region, we have some of the most valuable timber trees by unit that you can find anywhere in the United States. Things like white oak and black walnut have very strong marketplaces, historically strong markets, depending on where we're at, for things like black cherry, sugar maple, red oak, and a variety of others. So there's significant economic value out there on the ground if that's one of your interests in terms of an investment on your property. I think one of the other things that gets overlooked is the importance of forest products as a sustainable source of materials for society. It's one of our most environmentally friendly and sustainable, renewable, and recyclable products that you can imagine. And so putting forest products into the marketplace is actually a very environmentally friendly activity that you can participate in as a landowner. And while you're doing that, you're also supporting very important rural industries. So the hardwood timber industry is very much a rural enterprise and oftentimes a family enterprise. And so when you're selling timber, you're actually supporting the maintenance of that industry on the landscape that provides jobs in a lot of rural areas where jobs sometimes are lacking. So that's a great thing as well. And then as we think about issues with climate, carbon capture is actually something that we can help with when we manage forests. And if we're thinking about harvesting timber, particularly when that timber is going into long-lived forest products, that actually serves as a source of carbon capture. And then we can grow new trees on that same location that we did the harvesting on to accumulate additional carbon. So in many ways, this is one of the answers to that increasing carbon in our environment due to the burning of fossil fuels. So this timber harvesting can be a really valuable and useful management tool for you as a landowner. But I understand, because I'm also a landowner, that many landowners have misgivings about harvesting timber, perhaps because of horror stories that they've heard from neighbors, or even seen things that they thought, I'm not sure I'd want to see that happen on my land. And I get that. So we're going to address some of those risk factors that you may look at when you're thinking about whether timber harvesting is for you. Here's some of the common concerns. Will my woods look bad when this process is done? Is it going to create erosion problems? How do I get a fair price in this marketplace? I may not understand this process of selling timber, and therefore I feel vulnerable in the process of trying to do it. Is it going to hurt the wildlife? And I think Adam has actually address some of that in fact, we can be using this as a positive tool. But many people have a concern that by harvesting timber, they're actually ruining their woods. And we'll talk about how we can look at that and mitigate some of those risks. And I think the starting point for that is to kind of admit, oftentimes as a landowner, that because we've not done something in the past, that means we're not aware of some of the particular aspects of how to manage it appropriately. So we need professional assistance to do that well. And so I would recommend pretty much to anybody to consult with a professional forester before thinking about having a timber sale, and then to utilize their services for the timber sale. And depending on what your state in, you can contact a variety of different agencies to get a hold of a practicing professional forester that can help you with timber sales. But this is a good regional site that actually has contact information for each individual state. I think the only one that's not covered here in the Midwest is Wisconsin. So you can do this callbeforeyoucut.com site to find information on how you can learn more about timber harvesting and connect with professionals. You can also contact folks with extension, just like the folks on this webinar, or your local or state Division of Forestry or Conservation Service to get a feel for who's available in your area to give you some professional assistance. So this is the best tip I can give you to help alleviate some of those risks. Some of the folks that actually provide services to landowners for selling timber and actually helping with forest management and timber management issues. First one on the list is consulting foresters. And these are private business people that work for landowners on a fee basis typically. Sometimes it's a flat fee, a per acre fee, or a commission basis based on the income from the sale. And they can help landowners in the marketing and marketing process of selling timber. And they're acting essentially as your agent in this sales process. And so you're paying them for that service to help you effectively get into the marketplace and avoid some of the pitfalls that we run into when we really don't understand that marketplace ourselves. We've not done this process before. They can provide some other valuable forest management services to you as well, including an inventory of your timber, which helps you with management planning, evaluation of your timber, which may help with some tax issues, which we'll talk about in a bit, and additional management assistance and management planning. Some other folks that can help with timber sales are industry foresters. And these folks are typically interested in purchasing forest products like standing timber or logs from landowners. And they are oftentimes either working for or acting as conduits to forest industry. And so they're essentially a type of procurement person looking to buy forest products for manufacturing purposes. And still, professional foresters can certainly provide you with professional advice and direction. You just need to recognize who's being paid for what. And so you're not paying these folks for their services. And so that payment has to come from somewhere. So essentially, they're typically getting their payment from the profits they make off of remarketing those materials. So you recognize some of the differences in terms of who you're hiring versus who you're working with. Typically, you're paying a consulting forester, but they're acting as your agent. You're typically not paying an industry forester. They're actually paying you for the timber, but they're expecting to get some profit out of that. So it's cutting into a little bit of what you're going to make off that sale. So recognizing those differences will help you to make some of those decisions about who to work with. Some services provided by foresters that you should be looking for when you're thinking about selling timber. This is a really important one, particularly if you're going to be a long-term owner with management objectives for your property, and you want to maintain your woodlands in a good condition for those objectives, and that is selecting the appropriate trees to sell. And so deciding what trees to sell into the market versus what trees to continue to grow has a huge impact on the future condition of your forest. And so it's really important to have a forester that's willing to listen to you, work with you about what your objectives are to make appropriate and intelligent decisions about that. If you want to sell into the market, it's a good idea to have some sort of estimate of volume and value. And that's something the foresters can provide for you in terms of when they work on the property, either doing inventories or running an actual sale to give you a valuation and an estimate of what that timber is actually worth. The familiarity with timber markets is really important. This helps inform partly what trees we're going to sell, what market environments are like. And so is this a good time to sell timber into the market? And in fact, it's so important that even though I'm a professional forester and have been for decades, I recently had a timber sale on my own property and elected to have a private consultant forester assist me with that sale, because even though I practice forestry, I'm not in the timber markets. The consultant forester is on a regular basis. And so he knows the actors, he knows the buyers, he knows the materials they're looking for. And I trusted him to make good decisions based on that. I provided him direction and advice on my objectives and what I was looking for as the end result of the sale. But I used his services to actually get into the marketplace and get the best price I could of that timber. Another really important part of that, and goes along with it, is the marketing and advertising of timber for sale. And so there are a variety of different companies out there that may be looking for different types of products from the forest at different times, and have different marketplaces that prices reflected in that. And so knowing that marketplace, knowing who to advertise those trees to, can actually result in significantly more income for the folks that have effectively advertised, something a forester can certainly help you with. Anytime you sell a valuable property like timber, you should have a contract. And so foresters can assist you with the development and working out of an appropriate contract to deal with the issues associated with your timber sale. And then somebody should be monitoring the logging. I heard a good saying many years ago, and that is, we don't necessarily do what's expected, we do what's inspected. And so having somebody keeping an eye on the logging to make sure that the contract stipulations are being followed, that good work is being done, or if the weather conditions go south, that the logging is shut down until we can get running again in a situation where we're not going to damage the site because it's too wet. That is another thing the forester can help provide you with as kind of a liaison with that logging crew. And so monitoring that job is an important part of completing the sale successfully. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the tax considerations associated with selling timber and some of the benefits that it can provide if you know how to take advantage of those and have the information you need, something a forester can give you. And then oftentimes, both before and after a timber sale, we've got some management we need to do to get ready for the sale, and also some management that might be beneficial after the sale to get your woods in the best growing condition. So those are all things a forester can provide for you. The other thing that the forester does is act essentially, as I mentioned, as a liaison with the logging crew and the buyer. And so they're working between you and the loggers to help maintain good communications and set up expectations of how this is going to go. They're going to inform you some as to what you should be expecting in terms of the results of a timber sale on your property, because it's going to change the look of your property, almost no matter what the intensity or type of harvesting we do. And then they're going to work with the logging crew and the buyers to make sure that they're sticking by the stipulations in our contract and meeting the expectations you have as a landowner as well. And so that relationship is very important to help set the stage for a high quality job. Let's get a little bit into the biology now. And we've had a good lead in from both of our previous speakers on some of the different types of timber harvesting that can happen. I want to relate this directly to some of the tree species that it may actually help benefit that could be meeting your objectives on your property. And so we have relative shade tolerance across a spectrum for the regeneration of many of our hardwood trees. Some of them will tolerate a lot of shade. And so the very tolerant trees can regenerate in the shade of their parents or other species. And so it's things like sugar maple, beech, the hornbeam and hop hornbeam, flowering dogwood, pawpaw. Those can come up under the shade of other species. And so they're not necessarily dependent on the disturbance that's created by harvesting to grow, but they can grow better if the forest is thinned to some extent, providing additional space for growth. And in that tolerant range is also some additional maples, both red, silver, and box elder are all maples. And then we've got basswood, persimmon, and buckeye. Now we've got species that need a little bit of disturbance. So they typically like diffuse sunlight and or disturbances like fire to regenerate. And so we've got things like eastern white pine, bald cypress, many of our oaks, white ash, and even American chestnut. are dependent on some light getting into the forest understory. And so this is a situation where we can use a variety of different harvesting techniques to provide that additional sunlight that's favorable to them, but doesn't allow these really fast-growing species that grow in full sunlight to outrun them. And we'll talk about some of those techniques. And then we've got the intolerant and very intolerant species. And these are species that need a significant amount, if not full sunlight, to regenerate successfully. And so here we're thinking about pretty significant disturbance in the forest environment, creating larger openings, more sunlight to allow these species to come in and grow. So to get that full extent of forest diversity in terms of the trees that we may be interested in, we need a diversity of different harvesting techniques available to us on the landscape to provide the correct conditions for them to continue to regenerate and grow well. And so I'm going to show you some of the particular harvesting techniques we've got in our toolbox. And you've seen several of these before. What I'm going to try to do is show them in the context of fairly quickly after the harvest and then progression of time down the road. And the one with the least visual impact on your forest, but also does the least amount of disturbance and therefore allows the least amount of sunlight, is the single tree selection harvest. And you can see scattered stumps in this woodland. This is actually up in Michigan, but it was a location that really provided a good view. This is very favorable to the shade-tolerant trees like sugar maple, beech, basswood, dogwood. Those are the ones that are going to do well in this environment. This environment ultimately is going to exclude many of the other moderately tolerant or intolerant species that need full sunlight or partial sunlight to regenerate. So we wouldn't expect to see oaks or hickories, black walnut, tulip tree successfully regenerating in this type of harvest. So that's kind of an over the ground view. This is kind of a canopy view. And so you get a feeling for we've got some thinning that's happening in the canopy, but there's not enough big holes of light and space to come down and really provide a lot of sun to the forest floor. And in fact, we can use this single tree selection in some cases as a thinning harvest. And so we've got these two tulip trees here. They're actually growing in a plantation. And you can see that the crowns have crowded each other significantly. That's slowing growth down on both these trees. We may have an opportunity using single tree selection to thin one of these trees out, send it to the marketplace to make wood products, and provide additional growing space for that remaining tree to continue growing well into the future. So actually harvesting some trees as a process of crop tree release. Now, included in this uneven age system that includes single tree selection, gradually leading to a forest with many different ages of trees, we can do something called a group selection. And you've seen some graphic depictions of this earlier. And so this is right after a group harvest opening. And so we have come in, and typically it's an area of about 1 acre to 2 acres, sometimes a little smaller, that will harvest all of the trees in that area. And what's marketable is taken off. What's not marketable, we still typically will cut down, so we've got full sunlight coming into that landscape. And so right afterwards, you can see quite a bit of slash and debris on the forest floor. Once again, we recognize the wildlife benefits of having some of that there. And then we're going to get seeds and seedlings coming up in that area because of the full sunlight. And so gradually, these areas start thinning in and greening up. This is just a couple of years after. 3 to 5 years after. At this point in time, you're probably not going to be walking in there very much. Pretty dense, lots of diversity, lots of food value, lots of cover value for wildlife. And the diversity, I think, is really one of the big selling points of this, is we can get all different types of tree species regenerating in these, from the very middle where we got maximum sunlight to the outside edges where we've got partial shade. And so this is a really wonderful tool to add species diversity, but also structural diversity, how thick and how tall that vegetation is to your forest environment without creating really big openings. So it's very friendly to a lot of smaller ownerships. And a few years down the road, about 15 is where this is in terms of when the opening was originally created. You can see we've now got a closed canopy young forest that's providing shade and pretty easy to walk through at this point in time, and still a good diversity of species in this opening. And you've seen some previous mentions of this, the shelterwood harvest approach. This is a pretty good technique for regenerating some of the intermediate shade tolerant species like our hickories and oaks, and even some of the conifers like white pine that'll tolerate some shade. And what we typically are doing is coming in and taking the understory out beneath a canopy of trees that are going to cast seed of species we're interested in. In this case, it's an oak stand. So we've taken out the understory. We're going to even thin the overstory to some extent to provide diffuse sunlight into that forest understory. And to start with, once again, looks a little rough, but about a year after, we get this really wonderful green up on some of these sites. And we've actually included tree tubes in this, protecting some oak seedlings from deer browse, hoping to get a little bit of oak back in this area. In some locations, we get pretty good natural oak regeneration. On this really highly productive site, it's really having trouble competing with a lot of other species. So we're actually planting a few oak into this area. We can also use fire in these areas in some respects to manage and maintain the openness or create a little bit of the openness of the shelterwood system. And then depending on your objectives and how your regeneration is advancing, you can leave this like this for many years. We're typically waiting until the oak seedlings, if that's our target, are 5 or 6 feet tall before we would start thinning out the overstory. So they would be competitive with any faster growing trees that would get established or start growing in that area. But you could leave that there longer if that's a structure or a look of forest that you're really interested in. So a lot of flexibility with shelter woods that provide a lot of neat structural potential and the opportunity to regenerate several species that are difficult to regenerate otherwise. Here's an overstory view of the shelter woods, so you get to feel a little more open canopy than the single tree selection. And then ultimately we would thin that canopy out to release these understory regenerating seedlings to have more sunlight through time. So maybe 1 or 2 harvest cuts to take these big trees off with time. And this is a picture you always see from folks that don't want you to harvest timber. And I totally get it. This does not look good. This is a clear cut right after the clear cut is done. And this is certainly, for many folks, aesthetically an argument against doing this practice. But it's important to recognize that this is providing an opportunity to regenerate light-loving species of trees, shrubs, plants, herbaceous plants of all different types, and provide a completely different type of habitat than we have in many of our older closed canopy forests. And we don't have to clear cut the landscape. We can clear cut in patches on properties. And so it could be as small as 2 or 3 acres, but we typically get some additional benefits by being a bit bigger. So this is a year after. So this is about the second growing season after a clear cut. And you can see already we're getting really significant green up here. We've added some oak seedlings and tree tubes once again to this planting because tulip tree tends to dominate a lot of these clear cuts where we do our work in southern Indiana. So we're hoping to get some more oak kind of invested in those sites, provide them a little bit of advantage over the deer browse that happens. And then about 3 or 4 years afterwards. So the green up is really rapid. And once again, we've got an enormous diversity of trees and shrubs in this area, a lot of food value, a lot of cover value for wildlife, and an opportunity to regenerate species that are simply not going to regenerate in partial or full shade. And then once again, after about 12, 15 years, the canopy shades out a lot of the brush in the understory, kind of opens up. We've got a different structure of forest now, and it's a forest you can essentially re-enter and utilize as kind of a lower stature but closed canopy forest. And in fact, this one's about 25 years old. I believe that was in the Hoosier National Forest, clear cut, and they've actually come in and started thinning to do some crop tree release to favor oaks in this particular area over time. So turning into a really attractive and very productive forest area for both timber and wildlife. And if you are concerned about wildlife, Adam did a great job of setting the stage of how these different silvicultural techniques, the management of trees and forests, can have an impact on wildlife populations. We've got a large-scale long-term forest practices study in southern Indiana that's looking at a variety of different wildlife species responses to forest management practices. And one of the species groups we're looking at are forest birds. And so what we did was did an inventory of forest birds in these study areas before any harvesting took place. And so this was all relatively mature, pretty much unbroken forest, both on a state park and in Yellowwood and Morgan Monroe State Forests. State parks not actively managed, state forests actively managed for a variety of different purposes. So you can see that at the top graph, pretty consistent across the landscape of the distribution of the dark green, which is the early successional birds, not very many of those because we've got closed canopy forest here. The light green, which was mature forest gill birds, and then all the other birds are in gray. And so kind of the generalists or a variety of different species there. Once we started implementing the harvest, you can see that we've got a significant difference in the diversity of birds and from what groups they're from, depending on what type of harvest we put in place. And so you can see that not a lot of change at Brown County State Park, no harvesting there. The control is once again no harvesting, but there's been some harvesting in the general area of that control. And so we've got a variety of different techniques now, either looking at the edge of where we did cuts or in the actual timber harvest areas themselves. And in fact, the site with the most bird diversity was the clear cut, and the second most diverse was the patch cut, which is a smaller version. You could think of it as our small group openings of the clear cut. So that early successional habitat was actually making a big difference in the diversity of birds on the landscape in that large forest block area. It's also important to have that some of that mature forest in those areas next to that, but that clear cut and that open area, early successional habitat was certainly providing a big plus in terms of bird diversity on the landscape. And we got some surprises out of this study. We kind of expected getting positive results from some of the what we consider early or mid-successional bird species, things like golden winged warbler, ruffed grouse, eastern whippoorwill. But we found a few examples of birds like worm-eating warblers that are supposed to be really strong affinity to large blocks of undisturbed older forest. We're utilizing the forest openings very heavily, both for feeding in terms of younger birds and also cover. And so what we've discovered is that in many cases, this diversity of habitats on the landscape we can create with timber harvesting is beneficial to a wider variety of species than we ever really expected it to be. So I've hopefully tried to address some of your concerns. Now let's talk a little bit about how to implement some of these practices on the ground. So some things you need to be thinking about to get ready for your sale before you actually have a timber sale. Definitely connect with a forester, talk with them about your options. But if you think you're going to go ahead, you need to look at your property lines and see if your property lines are well marked and accurately marked. If you understand where your boundaries are, if you can support that in terms of survey records or other information that you've got. If not, and there are disputes, see if you can work with your neighbors to settle where those lines are. If you can't get that done, it may be a good idea to do some work to get your lines established, because if you can't establish a good property line, in the process of marking timber, you'll need to stay off that line far enough to provide a safe buffer so you don't get into legal deep water in terms of potentially marking trees that don't belong to you. That can create some real problems, obviously. You also want to mark your boundaries in ways that are relatively long-lasting and easy to see. And so here in Indiana, we've got what's called a purple paint law. I didn't take the trouble to look at Illinois. I'm sure Chris can tell us if that's the case here, where you can simply use purple paint to a certain prescription on posts and trees to mark your boundaries. If you don't have that, you can certainly post signs for marking boundaries. The other thing is great is brightly colored fence posts or other markings like that are more permanent and help you keep track of your property boundaries for timber harvest and any future management you may do. And we've already been on this territory, and I'm going to reemphasize it. Working against invasive species prior to doing your harvest is really a critical point. Invasive species, although many of them are shade tolerant, will respond very positively to sunlight. And so killing to the best ability you've got those invasive species on your property before we do what we call turn the lights on with the timber harvest, thinning the forest down, creating more sunlight, more growing space, will help you get ahead of some of those invasions. If you don't do that, what we oftentimes see is a real explosion of growth of those invasive species. And so it's best to actually start this process 3 to 4 years at least prior to your plans to have a harvest. And to grapevines, I'm very much in the same book with Adam. I think grapevines provide enormous amounts of wildlife benefits, but there are places where grapevines can be really damaging to trees you want to grow because of their capacity to grow up into the canopies and cover over the tops. And so thinking about your objectives and where you want to actually emphasize tree growth as opposed to grapevine growth may help inform where it's a good idea to kill grapevines, because they're going to respond very positively to that additional sunlight and disturbance as well. And so this is an example of Japanese honeysuckle, a vine that can grow well up into trees, but also serves as a ground cover. And if you don't deal with this after you've had your timber sale, you're pretty much not going to have much opportunity to regenerate anything new. It's going to be dominated by something like this. So the importance of getting these under control before we actually start adding additional disturbance to the forest environment is very high. The other thing I did when I got ready to sell my timber was I sent a letter to each of my neighbors, letting them know what I was planning. I'm not asking them permission. I don't need to ask them permission to have timber sales on my property, but I'm trying to head off potential misunderstandings or problems. So I let them know what my plans were, let them know what the timeline looked like it was going to be, and that if they had any issues or anything, they needed to contact me about that. And I think that helped kind of set the stage. I've heard situations in the past where the neighbors didn't realize what was going on, and once the loggers got out there and started going to work, there was a scene that occurred. And so that's something you'd like to avoid, and we can best do that with some good, effective communication. So a little bit of lead in on how you could expect some timber to be sold, some of the different techniques, and we've got recommendations of what may work best for you versus some other options that sometimes see in the marketplace, but may or may not be the best choice for you. And so one of the types of sales that we typically use and oftentimes recommend to landowners in conjunction with a forester helping you mark that timber is what's called a lump sum bid sale. And this is where a forester has marked all the timber that's for sale, sent advertisements out to buyers, and they submit a bid for that total sale. So it's not an individual tree type of purchase. It's everything that's available, that's what they're bidding on. So everybody's comparing apples to apples when it comes time to administer that sale. Another thing that's pretty common in the landscape, but we don't necessarily recommend landowners go to this as their first choice, is what's called a share sale. And this is where the buyer and the owner of the trees get some agreed upon percentage of the value of the trees once they've been delivered to the mill. This oftentimes results in, to be honest, pretty expensive logging costs. Higher quality timber, if you're selling it on shares, you may be sacrificing a fair amount of value on that. So let's say you're getting 50% of the mill receipts for that. On lower grade timber that's maybe mostly what we call pallet grade, construction type material that's going into pallets, crating, things like that, not real high value. That, in some cases, is not a bad way to sell timber because we may have a hard time actually doing it on a bid sale. But if you've got higher quality timber that's going to bring decent money, and the market's looking very favorably at it, this may not be your best choice in many cases. A couple of techniques that are less commonly used, but you may still find them out there, is what we call pay as cut. This is where the buyer pays an agreed upon amount for each unit of wood that's harvested. I don't see that much in Indiana, and I don't imagine it's very common in Illinois either. And something that sometimes happens, particularly if you're working with a forester, is you may even do what we call contract logging. That's where a logger is strictly paid for their services to harvest the trees and get them out on a landing. And then the forester is helping negotiate the sale of different grades and species of trees to different market outlets. This is a lot more complicated and certainly not something I'd recommend a landowner do themselves, but in conjunction with the forester might be an option. But for most folks, because of the conditions that it sets up, the limited amount of risk that you're taking, a lump sum bid sale is a very good option for you in terms of selling timber. And that's oftentimes associated with what we call a sealed bid process. And so this timber is marked after you've had a discussion with a forester to talk about your objectives, let them inform you about the sale process. The forester will go out, mark the trees that are to be sold. They're going to measure those trees to determine how much volume's in them. They're going to grade them in terms of the grades that are commonly used in the industry to indicate quality. And from that, they can typically give you a valuation of what you might expect on a conservative basis for revenue from a sale. They will, based on the information they've collected, set up a date, time, and place for bids to be opened. And so they're going to send out solicitations to buyers that they know in the area that are interested in that kind of material. The other advantage of that is that because you're working with that forester, they're typically taking out of the list people who have been bad actors in the past. So either have not been good about payment or have done a poor job of logging in certain circumstances. So you get that filter there when you're working with that professional forester to help you make sure you don't have the bad actors working on your property. After those solicitations are sent out, usually there's a month to 2 months, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, where it's allowed for the buyers to actually go out and visit the site to take a look at the timber so they can satisfy themselves as to quality and volume present. I will tell you that some buyers who have been working with some foresters for a long time know how the foresters mark, and they will bid based off strictly the information they get in the mail. They never visit the site. I've always been surprised by that, but that is certainly how it happens sometimes. On the day that the bids are supposed to be submitted, everybody's bid has to be in before the deadline, and then the bids are open. And then you can decide who's going to be the winner. And typically there's a clause in your statements that allows you to reject any bids that you may be concerned about. So whether it's someone that the forester doesn't know or knows has a kind of a difficult reputation in terms of how they operate, you've got the right to do that refusal. And the forester typically assists you in that selection of the winning bidder process. But in many cases, you can select the top bidder that actually is going to purchase your timber. And then we get started with a contract process to complete the contract that outlines the process through which those trees are going to be sold, how you're going to be paid, and a variety of stipulations about how the work's going to occur on your property. So what can you expect in terms of how trees are marked? Typically, for particularly consulting foresters, you're going to have a couple of different locations of marks on the tree. And I would argue the most important one for you is the mark that's down close to ground line. And that's essentially a paint mark that serves as a receipt once the tree is cut, showing that tree should have been cut, that it was one of the marked trees. In addition, the forester keeps a tally of all trees marked. And so if more trees are cut than's on his tally, somebody's taking more trees than they should, then we've got a legal situation. Normally, we don't have that problem because the buyers don't want to get a bad reputation with the foresters. Will it have some sort of mark on the log of the tree so that the buyers can see it and know that that's a tree for sale? Sometimes for kind of standard timber, it's a dot or a band. For higher quality trees, we got a nice black walnut here. Oftentimes they're numbered, and particularly more information may be provided on those in terms of an estimate of maybe a veneer quality tree, which is our highest quality standard. This is just a sample sale where we change the names, but all the bids are accurate. And it gives an idea of the kind of diversity in terms of pricing that you may see in a bid sale. And so this is all pretty much sight unseen from each of the bidders. And we recognize that we've got, over 100% difference between the top and bottom bids. Bottom bid is half of what the top one is. And what we oftentimes find is folks are, in many cases, being solicited to sell timber by persons showing up at their door or sending them a postcard in the mail saying they would like to buy their timber. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, when you're not in a competitive process like that, how do you know whether that person offering to buy your timber is buyer number 1 or buyer 19? You don't. And then we also have to recognize that buyer number one probably wouldn't offer that price if they didn't think they were in competition with other people. And so having that competitive process where everybody's got to put their best dollar on the table oftentimes gives you an opportunity to at least get a fair market value, if not a premium value. Now, I will tell you that typically we don't see this many bids at most of the sales I see in Indiana. Much more common to see 4 to 8 bids on a timber sale here. But some of those exceptional sales or sales where the industry is really hungry for particular trees can get a lot of people out. So that competitive process can really make a huge difference for you in terms of selling your timber. Here's another example. This is low quality timber, what we would call an improvement harvest, where we're taking mostly low grade trees as a thinning to favor the growth of higher quality trees in our forest. 43,400 board feet. A board feet is 144 cubic inches of wood. That's how we measure wood volume. And this is what we call that pallet grade or low grade material primarily. And we were expecting a bid in the range of $8,000 to $10,000. We only had 3 bidders, but the top bid was $13,500. So we got a significant premium over what we thought we would get as compared to what would be normal circumstances. So you never know what's going to happen in those sales, but oftentimes that competitive process can be a great benefit for you in terms of making a better dollar on that timber sale. One of the other considerations folks have and concerns is actually managing for the potential for erosion in their forest. And this is a realistic and reasonable concern to have. The good news is that we've got a proven set of practices called best management practices. And many states actually have an outline of those best management practices available. Indiana has one through the Indiana DNR. I suspect Illinois is going to be very similar. These are practices that are utilized to help reduce the flow of soil off of roads and other soil disturbed areas, limit access to streams, and essentially keep that soil on the site and out of the waterways. And so some of the practices that are utilized on the left-hand side, water bars, which are simply a little hump angled on the road that shoots the water off of the road and onto the forest floor so it can soak back in. On the lower right here, we've got what's called a broad-based dip, which is a little larger structure, but has very similar activity in terms of shooting the water off of the road, making sure it's not carrying silt and gullying down the center of the road, and let it soak back into that forest floor. When it comes to stream crossings, we want to either minimize crossings and hard bottom with some gravel if we need to, or more and more often, there's timber bridges that are portable and available for logging crews to use, or they've actually developed their own that they can get across small streams without too much trouble. So stream protection and erosion control is a very important part of those best management practices. The other area we've got to think about in best management practices is what we call the yarding area, the log yard. This is where sorting, cutting into length, and loading of logs takes place. And so a lot of machine activity here. And so sometimes reseeding is called for, or erosion protection on those areas with best management practices. Sometimes, depending on the location, you might even put up some erosion barriers like hay bales or plastic sheeting. One of the things I did on my log yard was actually planted it back to some prairie flowers. And I like keeping it open because I intend to have future timber harvests. And so I'm really not interested in having that area grow back to trees. I'd rather it stay in herbaceous cover. And so this is a really nice cover, great for pollinators, good for wildlife, and then easy to take back down once I get ready to reuse the area for a log yard. And one of the things I would ask you to think about doing as part of your practices on your property when it comes to timber sales, and the forester will definitely help you in this category, is thinking about continual improvement of your property. And so by harvesting low grade, low quality, low value, poor vigor, decaying trees, we oftentimes have an opportunity to include those in a sale with some trees that are of better value. And so here's 2 examples. The right-hand side, a tree that was probably hit mechanically by something, maybe in the past harvest, decaying. And so there's still usable wood there. So we've got an opportunity to recover that value. On the left-hand side, 2 trees growing together. and they're going to gradually degrade each other in terms of growing together at that base. So it's an opportunity to take those trees and provide space for new, perhaps more desirable or longer lived trees, longer lasting trees to grow in those locations. One of the other things we've seen, and particularly in woodlands that have had past harvest, but maybe haven't been managed harvest by a forester, is some trees will get passed over because they're not real high economic value. So this is a hackberry on the left and a sycamore on the right. Neither of them have really high unit value, but they are utilized by the markets. And what they're doing is sapping up a lot of space. And so we've got an opportunity to harvest some of these larger, older, over mature trees if they're not meeting your objectives for other purposes, and provide additional growing space for perhaps some more young, vigorous trees to grow. And that's something that we would include in a harvest to essentially capture the value there and provide additional growing space for new trees. And that really goes to one of the other things you can think about doing in a property, and that's resist the temptation to what we call high grade, cut the best, cut the best and leave the rest. And this is a process that ultimately, both in terms of quality and genetics, degrades your forest land. So this is a really high quality black walnut tree, but it's not real big diameter yet. It's about 16 or 17 inches. And I know that because it's on my property. And I'm really happy to have it there. It's a completely marketable tree. The market would be happy to buy that tree. But I've got a lot more potential to get better value from that tree and also allow it to drop more seed and reproduce itself in some openings nearby if I let it grow. And so thinking about and working with your objectives, taking a longer term view and recognizing a lot of the gain and value is happening on some of these really high quality trees and letting them get more size can be really beneficial to you. That's where having that forester helping you with tree selection for the harvest is a really important aspect of good management. So how does this harvesting happen? Historically, it's been chainsaws and what we call skidders. And so the skidders are pulling the logs out of the woods, and it's a person on the ground with a chainsaw, and it's dangerous work. What we're seeing more and more, particularly in Indiana, but I think around the Midwest, is more feller bunchers. And this is a large and very expensive piece of equipment, but it's also very efficient and much safer than having somebody on the ground cutting the trees. It also provides some aspects of actually helping us with silvicultural practices too. It can very efficiently cut a lot of smaller diameter trees where we're creating openings. And so I'm actually very happy to see this piece of equipment on the ground because I think we can do better openings by cutting most of the trees in those openings very efficiently. We're used to, we'd have to send a work crew in to cut all those trees down to ground line, provide that full open growing space. So safer for the loggers, and in some cases better, depending on your objectives and the type of harvesting you're doing for landowners as well. So I want to emphasize that the logging is a difficult and dangerous job, and it involves a lot of skill. And if it weren't for loggers, we essentially would not be able to get our trees out of the woods. The logging industry has come a long way. There's a lot of great logger training programs out there, and many of the loggers are taking advantage of that. There's a lot of great equipment now that's being produced that's making their job safer, more efficient, and even better on the ground in terms of lower ground pressure, less damage to sites that they're working on. So I've seen great advances in terms of the efficiency of logging and the way they're working with landowners now. And so this just emphasize the position the logger plays in that whole process. You're the owner of the forest land. Private ownership is a big part of private lands management. And the wood is getting into the system, and that's the one bottleneck is the logger. And so we have to have them in the system to provide value for you as a landowner if you're interested in selling timber. And so supporting them in terms of training, good treatment, sending that wood through the system is really helping keep that whole process going. And then once it's in the system, there's all different types of products that can be made into. And depending on where you're at, you may be working into each of those different product categories. So getting ready to wrap up here, some final considerations. You can actually get some tax advantages if you know how to do it when you're selling timber. So trees sold, and one of the ways we mentioned selling them as a lump sum sale standing, as standing timber. if you've owned it for at least a year, may be eligible for long-term capital gains tax treatment, which is a lower rate than standard tax rate. Costs associated with selling timber can be deducted prior to figuring your tax on the income. And then if you know your basis in the timber that you own, you can use that to offset some of your tax liability as well. So what is basis? Basis is the value of the timber at the time you purchased it or acquired it as part of an estate, inherited it, essentially. And a forester can actually help you calculate that basis and determine how much basis value you might have in timber that could be applied against income to save you on income taxes. And if you're a relatively recent inheritor or purchaser of timberland and are having a timber sale, this could save you a significant amount of money. And so it's another good reason to utilize the services of a forester while selling timber. I don't have the additional hour it would take to talk about basis and some of these tax issues. So I'm going to refer you to the timbertax.org website. It has a great conversation there about the taxation of timber, how to look at basis, how it can be utilized, and how to figure it. But you're going to need the assistance of a forester to get you into that process. So something to consider, and definitely not something to walk away from in terms of tax savings. Now, the advantages of basis are the most if you're relatively close to the time of acquisition when you sell your timber. If we think about it, as you own that property, more and more of the value of the timber is a capital gain. It's the growth that happened while you own the timber. But the value of the timber at the time of acquisition is that basis, and that can be applied against the income you get. But if you inherited a property 20 years ago that had great big white oak or black walnut on it at the time, there's still significant basis there. So it may still be very much worthwhile to have that figured. The other thing you can do is, if you're interested in passing something really valuable to heirs, is you can pass appreciated land, including timber, to heirs and get a stepped up value when, unfortunately, you pass on, but they inherit it. And so they can actually reestablish the basis at that time of inheritance to the fair market value at the time of they are inherited. And if they were to have a timber sale shortly after that, what that means is they would have minimal tax liability because they can apply an enormous amount of basis value against income on the property. So it's a neat way to pass an appreciated asset to heirs in timberland. Once again, that timber tax website is going to give you a lot of great information on how to look at that as a potential planning tool. So what I really hope to do is provide you kind of an insight into how timber harvesting happens, and most importantly, think about how, if you're considering this as a very valuable management tool on your property, you can deal with some of the risks. So working with a forester, having that forester help you have a contract that stipulates how this harvesting is going to be done and under what conditions. All the trees to be sold are going to be marked, and so everybody knows what is being done and what's being sold. Effective marketing to get you the best price possible, along with that competitive price, so everybody knows they've got to put their best dollar on the table. We encourage you to get paid as part of your contract process before any trees are cut. What's happened in some cases is companies have gone out of business or simply disappeared. They've taken the logs, but you never got your last check. And so being paid in full before the trees are cut is a good plan. The contract will help stipulate the conditions of logging and setting expectations, and your forester help monitoring those to make sure those expectations are met. And in Indiana, and I imagine many other states, there's a licensing system for timber purchasers. So they have to be licensed with the state and bonded. That may not be the case in all states, but oftentimes there is some sort of licensure or bonding associated with that as a safeguard to folks selling timber. And then look for loggers that have had logger training, both in terms of safety and operations. They're going to do a better job on your property, and your forester, once again, is going to know the territory and oftentimes can include that as a stipulation in the contract. So with that, I think I'll stop here, and Chris, see if there's any questions.